evening. I'd like to welcome, on behalf of the UAF and Summer Sessions and lifelong learning, all of you who are in the room here with me and our guests, and also those who are tuned in via live stream. This evening's lecture is with Dr. Chris Cannon, who is with the College of Indigenous Studies at UAF. My name is Kathy Alton, and I belong to an organization called Delta Kappa Gamma, which is an organization that supports educators. Members of our organization will be introducing all the Discover Alaska lectures until the middle of August. Okay, before introducing the speaker, I would like to read the acknowledgement statement. At UAF, we acknowledge the Alaska Native Nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. In Fairbanks, our Trophieta campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Dene people of the Lower Tanana River. Okay, our guest speaker, I could say, is Dr. Chris Cannon. He comes to Alaska from Helena, Montana. He arrived here in 2001, and since 2008, he has spent a lot of time with the Indigenous folks, both in Alaska, in rural areas, and in Canada. With no further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Cannon.
Wired up, so I hope it's being too loud there. I'm going to play here this slideshow real quick and make sure I can advance both ways. Is there? Do you know how to advance backwards, or is it only a forward advance? Thank you. All right, so today I'll be talking about work that I've done across Alaska and Canada for the last 15 or 16 years, working with elders to document and learn about Northern Dene astronomical knowledge in as comprehensive manner as I'm able to do. A lot of the work is land-based, traveling with elders, going on hunting, fishing trips, going on the trap line, doing interviews, working a lot with language documentation. And so the focus today is really just sharing kind of the essence of what Northern Dene astronomical knowledge and practices are kind of all about, but really tonight the focus will be really on the stars in this very significant constellation. The work that we've done, however, is related to really all different aspects of and phenomena in the sky, like northern lights and halo phenomenon, and ideas about thunder and lightning, eclipses, and really everything from the upper atmosphere to space. So the aims of this work, like I mentioned, are really to understand how Northern Dene integrate the sky and its contents into cosmology, spirituality, worldview, and other practical aspects like weather forecasting, navigation, and time reckoning. The work that I've done with elders spans 12 different languages, 12 different Dene languages. If you're not familiar with the word Dene, that's synonymous with Athabascan. The word Athabascan's fallen out of use in Canada, and so I just use Northern Dene as a cover term to refer to all Athabascan/Dene peoples in Alaska, Canada, and beyond. Before I begin, there's a list of the contributors, the Dene contributors to this work. I think there's approximately 65 on that list. I worked with about 100, but these are the individuals who really made direct contributions. This is a map just to show you the approximate traditional lands of Northern Dene peoples, and the different divided regions there are showing different language groups. There's approximately 45 Dene languages. About 30 of those are in the north in Alaska and Canada. Apache and Navajo are also in the Dene language family. There's 7 languages there, and then there's about 8 Pacific Coast Dene languages in southern Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. In comparison, this map here shows the different communities where I worked with elders, and for the most part, it spans that Northern Dene region. I want to talk a little bit about kind of the merit, or why care about the sky. Cultural knowledge of the sky is something that's kind of regularly been overlooked by those working in the social sciences. For comparisons, there's a little over 7,000 languages in the world, and about 15% of those are well documented with grammars, dictionaries, texts, audio recordings, and things like that. But if you look at the number of languages, cultures that have really well documented knowledge of the sky, it's less than about 1% of world languages. And so what I'm getting at here is our understanding of how humans know and relate to the sky is really based on a very small percentage of the world's cultural diversity. And so my estimate is there's fewer than 50 book-length studies on cultural knowledge of the sky that's informed directly from indigenous people. Most of the work's been done on archaeological evidence like Stonehenge and other sites that are considered archaeoastronomy or archaeological, so artifacts that are left by past cultures, but there's not really a way to inform how those were used by living people. It's kind of a time-sensitive topic. Cultural practices relating to the sky have kind of, they have or are falling out of use unless they're, consciously being maintained, because, there's different technologies now that have replaced a lot of the uses for astronomical knowledge, like weather forecasting, time reckoning, wayfinding, those things. There's also, light pollution's a big issue. There's also a lot of, more increased indoor living, globalization that carries ideas around the world very quickly. There's the aspect that, cultural knowledge can be displaced by other knowledge systems. I think it's important to talk about the light pollution part. I've got some statistics up here from a recent paper that attempted to quantify global light pollution, and it's pretty eye-opening. The paper found that 80% of the world and 99% of the US by population experience light polluted skies. By land area, 80% of Europe and about half of the US cannot see the Milky Way. And the Milky Way is obscured from about a third of humanity 60% of Europeans and 80% of Americans live in places where you can't see the Milky Way. And so we are kind of lucky in Alaska that we have that opportunity. But if you think about, indigenous cultures all around the world, there's the one issue of, maintaining those practices. But if you can't even see the stars or sky, that's an issue that, is incredibly problematic to work around, in terms of maintaining that knowledge and passing it on. Okay, so I'll try to get going here and talk about this work. I really like to start out by talking about the process of kind of being immersed into this and the process of learning, because it turns out that it's significant, and the way that you learn in that process is really as significant as the knowledge itself. And so I find it difficult not to spend some time talking about kind of my struggle to figure out how to learn about the sky in a deep and meaningful way. And so when I started this, I was not even a master's student yet. I was working at the Museum of the North in education outreach, and I was on a NASA-funded space grant to go to rural communities and teach, Western concepts of astronomy to school kids with a inflatable planetarium. And during that work, a lot of the kids would have these cultural responses to the content, like asking me if, the northern lights will chop off their head, or, they just start whistling or something like that. And so just to inform myself, I thought, I really need to look into this and educate myself about, indigenous or Alaska Native knowledge of the sky in particular. And so I went to the libraries or the library here and searched online, and there's pretty good information for, Inuit cultural knowledge of the sky, but the more that I kind of looked into Northern Dene, I kept finding very interesting statements like the knowledge is extremely slight and it's not a significant part of culture. And, that didn't seem to align very well with kind of what I would think, especially given that there's so much darkness in the winter and opportunities to engage with the sky. And so I ended up in the Alaska Native Language Archive and was a research assistant there for a while. And I was just looking for unpublished grammars, dictionaries, word lists, school lessons, anything that might have a word or a name for a star or a constellation. And so I just started compiling these word lists to try to get a picture of what kinds of things have names, what are those names, comparing them against each other and looking for patterns. And after doing this for about 3 years, looking through thousands of documents, I saw that there's really only one constellation that has a name in Dene languages that's well attested across the subarctic. And that's a name for the Big Dipper. And I thought that was pretty curious. There's one form there on the left column, Hyati in Gwich'in, and there's another form like Nicoltani in Otna. And one basically means seated in the sky or his house, and the other means, it's a verb that describes a rotating motion overhead. And I thought, this is interesting. It's only 7 stars, the Big Dipper. It's not that big. And what about all the other stars in the sky that seem to not have names? And so that's really what got me going and motivated me to go work with elders and begin asking. I started asking just people if they knew any names for stars in their language. And I had connections because I also worked at the Gwich'in Steering Committee. It's a nonprofit. And so I had traveled to Gwich'in communities for a few years also. And so I began working in Arctic Village in Fort Yukon first with elders. And the first person who I really met who knew this knowledge of the sky in a very intimate and deep way was Paul Herbert. Many people know him as Snook. A family in Fort Yukon sent me over to knock on his door and So go talk to him. And so, you know, I knocked on his door, and it was intimidating because, you know, I was just kind of in the hot seat. He was wondering who I am and what I'm doing there and all these things. And I was very clueless to, you know, this kind of work, because I was not even a master's student yet in a social science. My degree before that was wildlife biology. And so it's not the recommended way of doing this, but at the same time, I wasn't pursuing a degree or research or anything. I was just trying to learn something. And it led to all of this, you know, kind of really a life change and putting me on a new track to, you know, the kind of work that I do today. But Paul was, you know, we still work together. We're working on a project now, but this was back in 2011. I knocked on his door, and, you know, this was late November, I walked past a black bear that was by his door, you know, which would indicate that he got it out of its den. And I went in his house, and, you know, it was, like I said, it was kind of a hot exchange, but then he gave me tea and eventually asked me what I wanted to know about the stars. And that's how we had our first conversation. And, you know, I had star maps and notes and all these things. And he said, you know, we're not going to use any of that. You know, if you want to learn about this, you have to come outside and travel with me. And he said it might take 4 or 5 years, but you might understand if you stick with it. And he said, we can't do this now, it's light out, you know, and I had to fly back. And so anyways, it took a couple years. I got an NSF grant. I enrolled in a graduate program. The director of the archive became my graduate committee, because he was saying, you're doing all this work, you know, you should get a master's degree. So that's how it all started. But then it took 2 years to get funding, and I eventually finally ended up back at Snook's house in Fort Yukon. And, you know, I was waiting all this time. The first trip he told me that, you know, that Big Dipper, that's just a part of this much larger constellation. He said the Big Dipper is really called Vitsi, which means his tail, and he has a nose or a snout, and he said there's a lot more to it, and if you come back I'll show you. And so it took, you know, over 2 years to get back there, and then I ended up there back in I think March 2013. Just perfectly clear sky, and it's like 20 some below zero, very cold, but just crystal clear. It was just perfect, and we were kind of waiting there for it to get dark. And you know, we went out. He lives right on the Yukon River. We went outside his cabin, and, you know, my chair was with me, and one other person was there too. And he took us out by the river, and he just started naming stars in all different quadrants of the sky. And you know, this was the first time I'd ever read or heard about anything like this. And so everywhere he was naming was a different body part. You know, that's his hand, that's his eyes, that's his body, his left foot, his right foot. There's his cane in his hand, you know. And it's too big to see all in one view. It's beyond your peripheral vision, and so you really have to spin around to see it all. And it covers the entire visible portion of the sky. And so that, you know, there's not too much like that from what's been documented, you know, this kind of idea of a whole sky constellation. And so this list shows the different names in Gwich'in. Most of them are body parts. And eventually, I guess maybe I skipped it already, but there's an image of what this looks like, but I'll get to that. So anyway, we went back in his house, and obviously the next question was, well, who is Hyati, right? And, you know, he said, we're not going to talk about that. And he said, you know where he is, and that's as far as we're going to go with this today. And that was really kind of setting the foundation for learning, and kind of an invitation to be curious and start trying to be an active learner and put these things together for yourself. And so that's the process that I really had to learn, is that, you know, when you're working in different cultures produce knowledge in different ways. Like what we're doing now is passive learning. You're listening to me tell you things. And, you know, reading a book is passive learning too. But active learning is, you know, when you experience something directly. and learn by doing it. And that's the way that, many indigenous cultures produce knowledge, is through direct experience. And even when like stories are told, like who told that, there's always this attribution of where that comes from, or where that experience comes from is always attributed. And so that was important, for the elders I worked with to learn in this way too, that you don't just get told this information, but you really have to figure it out for yourself. That's part of it. But it's kind of this guided process into that. And so showing me the stars was the foundation, but now I had to figure it out on my own by, paying attention, listening to, the stories, but also paying attention to where we were going and what the place names were, and kind of, figure it out. So we started doing lots of trips together. And a lot of this was in the summer when no stars are visible. And this went on for a few years, and I thought, how am I learning about the sky when we're, going hunting and there's no stars out? It was just a very confusing experience. And I was working with other elders too, and like collectively I picked up things and began putting things together. And this work that I did with Snook, the really significant thing to me was that a lot of the places that we were going are along the Porcupine River. And this is the route that this traveler figure from the time of the world's transformation traveled down this river to transform an ancient world into the world that we have today. And that this traveler's name is Chite Hakoi. And it's the one who paddled among things. And so the world was full of animals, but they were giant animals, and humans and animals could speak, but these giant animals would kill people and eat them. And so humans in this time were the hunted, and the animals were the hunters. And so the job of this transformer figure was to instill balance and order in the world, and to establish laws and protocols for relating to all things. And so this journey around the world is really also the story of the first vision quest. And the traveler is in the process of becoming a very powerful medicine person. And the stories usually start where, as indicated by the name of this traveler, started out paddling in summer. And he began working with small things like or more benign animals like a ptarmigan or a snowshoe hare. And as the journey progresses, he embodies the knowledge and power of all of those things that he transformed, and at the same time, in exchange for the animal becoming, a more useful type of animal for humans, humans have to treat that animal in a certain way. And so if you're hunting, there's what things that you do when you kill a moose, and there's certain protocols for not just animals, but really all things, plants, and this is Dene worldviews are very relational, and they're the world is very animate, and essentially all things have some sort of sentience or animating life force. And so this has relevance to talking about the sky. The northern lights are alive, the stars are alive, and a lot of these things are much bigger than you and more powerful. And so there's rules around that, like you really don't talk about the stars. You don't point your finger at the stars, because it's like, going up to somebody very powerful and talking in their face, or pointing in their face and talking about them. And so these things are just, it's not something you do. And so learning about the stars is not something that elders like to just talk about. It's part of this way of relating to all things. And so anyway, some of these pictures are places where transformations happened. That bluff there with a kind of striated pattern in the rocks is where this traveler figure killed a giant caribou and threw its guts against the rock. And so that rock is Vadzaitric, caribou guts or caribou rumen. and it's a place name, but it also has a story. And so that's what's really neat too about bumping around with an elder and learning in an active way, is that when I went into the Yukon Flats and Porcupine Plateau the first time, it's flat. I think it drops 100 feet over 300 miles or something of river. It's flat, and when you go off the river in the 10 yards, you can't see anything. There's no landmarks to wayfind. And so when I was experiencing that for the first time, it seemed like just the empty wilderness, But then, spending time, you see how landscapes become socialized. You have experiences on the land, and you remember, that's where we camped, or, I remember the place name there, or, you connect the place with the story, and along the way, that's also showing you how to behave and live your life and relate to things, and you're reminded of how the world was transformed, and that worldview is being lived and experienced and remembered. And it's just a really fascinating experience to see something that you know nothing about, like a landscape, and it becomes familiar through a particular cultural or social context. It relates to language, it relates to culture, but the other thing is it relates to personal experiences there. And so landscapes become familiar in multiple different ways. But anyway, that was kind of, the lesson that I was, the journey of putting this together was traveling the land and paying attention to really what it is that we're doing without talking about the sky or stars really at all. And just to kind of further demonstrate the kinds of things that we were doing and learning, really, it was, to learn about the sky, or really, in my opinion, to learn deeply about any cultural topic, you really kind of have to become immersed in living that life. And, to learn about the sky, you really have to learn kind of about everything else too. And so, these pictures on the top here are fish bones, and they're you're sitting there eating the fish, and you come to this bone in your fish, and there's a story about that relates to the transformation of the world. And so while you're eating your dinner, you remember these things, and that's how the knowledge is reinforced and remembered and lived. Is that first bone there in the upper left is it's the bone in the nose of a broad whitefish, and that's a moose hoof. And the next one is a bone in a burbot's mouth, in the roof of the mouth, and that's like a barn swallow or a bird of some sort. And then the last one is near, I think that's the gill, like the jaw or gill, along the gill rakers of a suckerfish, and that's a pair of moose antlers. And there's stories about how these bones ended up, these fish swallowing these animals. And I'm not real clear on this story, but it is one that's repeated across the subarctic. But the point is that really everywhere you look, that the spruce pitch on a tree is part of the transformation of when the traveler tried to transform wolverines, and it was lighting a fire under the tree, and these wolverines were pissing and snotting all over the fire. And, there was kind of this stalemate, and this transformer agreed to kind of let them be, as long as those little baby wolverines wouldn't get any bigger than they are, and that they would provide a gift for humans, and that was spruce pitch, which is, it's a medicinal thing used for if you're sick, you can put it in hot water or tea or on cuts and things like that. And so it really is, it heals the tree, it heals people. And so really everything, in this relational worldview, you experience that, and working with, a knowledgeable elder or member of a culture who heard all these stories and lived that life. It's just such a gift to see how it's all connected and how all of those things reinforce one another. And so this took a long time, but eventually I became to realize that, this huge constellation in the stars must be this traveler figure who went around the world. And one other thing that Snook told me before, when he told me that constellation and said, we're not going to talk about who he is, he gave me a riddle, and that's also kind of what set things off. He said, there's one little red star up there that some people can see, and he said, not many people can see it, but if you find it, tell me about it. And, that I lived in a dry cabin those years, and I went out every night looking for this little thing. I didn't know where it was, but over time working with other elders, I realized that, it must be the star that's his heart. And the heart is also equivalent with spirit. And so why that's important is because through this process of transformation of the world, everything in the world, even grass and rocks and water and everything, this traveler embodied the knowledge and power of all of those things that it worked with. And so its heart and spirit really is the embodiment of the world's spirit. And when you find this little red star, the significance of it is that you also realize where you come from, and that you too are ancient and continuous through time, that your spirit is in this human form now, but you may have been that rock or ladybug or grasshopper or anything. And when you go on your vision quest, and I know there's variation here, but this is how I learned about it. When you go on your vision quest, you receive these visions that are your allies and your helpers, and really what that is your memory of your former incarnations coming back to you, and you're gaining back that knowledge of what it is to see and sense like a fox, and have that perspective of all of those things. And so if you have a lot of these guardians, helpers, that means that you're an old spirit, right? And that you gain these perspectives back, and that knowledge of, seeing, smelling, hearing like a fox is power. And you basically gain this back, and you become full. And when you pass away, you carry that full spirit with you, and you journey back along the Milky Way Trail, which is the path that the traveler took around the world. But it's also this trail that unites the cosmos. And you go back to Hyati, and some people say you stay up there. Some elders refer to it as heaven. Some say that you're sent back down as something else again. But the idea is that, there's this understanding that everything is related, right? And so that really informs how you treat all things in the world, because, the tree is your relative, the water is your relative, the rock is your relative, and you don't know when you're, in that form or related or quite how it all worked, but you are continuous through time, and your body is discontinuous. It's this human experience now, but there's this deeper part of it that is intimately connected with this constellation. And so the constellation, if you look at how it's positioned, the drawing it's a very difficult thing to put in as an illustration, but it's crouched on all fours, kind of like a crouching person, and it's really with its body protecting the world. And so this is a guardian, it's an ally, it's a teacher, it's a gamekeeper. So when you're a hunter, it's not because you're a good hunter, it's because you're following all those ancient laws, and you're rewarded with the animal because you're living your life as you should, according to customary law that was put down at the time of the transformation of the world. Is this clock right up there, or can you give me a quick time just so I don't go over? Okay, sounds good. So the next part I want to talk about is the morning stars. And so anyways, this was kind of filling in that big mystery of, Hyati is really this one constellation, and there's all these other body parts. And it's not just, constellations are so much more than pictures in the sky with stories. This is really, an epistemology, a model for how to live, how to learn, how to be in the world, how to relate to all things, where you come from, how the world came to be. And the morning stars are also like that. And there's 3 of them shown up here. And this is not a real picture, it's from a computer simulation. But you can see the Big Dipper up there, that would be his tail. And then these 2 stars here, this is Arcturus, and I forget this one, but there's these 2 stars, that's his foot. That'd be his left foot. And there's 3 morning stars, and none of them are Venus. And so if you're talking, if you're doing this as documentation work, and you say, what's the name of the morning star? There's all this confusion in like dictionaries that Venus is this, but it's not Venus. And so you have to really dig deeper and say, okay, what is a morning star? We need to identify. That's the importance of like being outside and doing this, is that there's a lot of things that can get lost in translation. Just the English words that are used like morning star or Little Dipper. Most elders, when they say Little Dipper, are referring to the Pleiades, which is not Ursa Minor, right? And so there's differences that really kind of have to be pieced apart to really make sure you know what you're hearing. And so anyways, these morning stars are something that children were kind of raised on throughout the subarctic in Alaska and Canada. And children were taught to go look for these in the morning. And here in Fairbanks, you'll see them in late October and November. I remember the first time that I saw them, I was on the phone with Snook because this was another thing that I had to find. And I drove, I think it was 4 in the morning, I drove to the top of Esther Dome, and I was on the phone with him. He's in Fort Yukon, and I'm just trying to walk him through like what I'm seeing. And so I know you can see them up there in November if you get up very early. But the point is that these were stars that children were told to go look for in the morning as part of a training. And you go look for them and you find them. And the morning stars are also a model to live by. And in Gwich'in, one of the names for them is Yedak Kahajil, which means that they rose up. And they're really, they're considered to be 3 spirits that are rising straight to Yati. And so they're not following the Milky Way trail, they're going straight up. And really the idea here is that, they're spirits that followed all these customary laws, and they're light and untethered spirits that aren't weighed down by emotional baggage or material possessions, and so they're going straight up. And so kids were taught to look for these so that they too will live their life like the morning star. Like you don't want to be weighed down with too many emotional problems, or material possessions is a big one that weighs you down. Having too many things, it keeps your, the metaphor is it keeps your pack sack heavy, and so it keeps you tethered to this earth and not being this light spirit that goes straight up. The other part of it is they're rising right before daylight, and so when a spirit, when somebody passes away or something passes away, what I learned is that the spirit rises with the rising sun. And so that's what's happening there too. And they're also used for timing hunting activities, which is also very significant here. Taking a life. You're taking the life when these morning stars are out and when that spirit goes straight up. But they're also a clock. And so when the first morning star there on the upper left came into view, that's when you need to be awake in the morning. And ways that people woke up with this is oftentimes they drink tea. Like if they're going to go hunting, you drink a lot of tea and you have to go out and use the bathroom, and you look, there's no morning star yet. Go back to bed, drink some more tea, and then you come up, oh yeah, the morning star's out. I better stay up now. It's time to get dressed. And then by the second star, you really need to be done with your breakfast. And these are about 40 minutes apart. They're not far. And oftentimes when I see them, to me, they seem like they kind of all come into view together. And so, but elders are very strict about how these are used, and that this is the way. And so by the second one, you're all dressed. And by the third one, you have to be out on the land hunting. And if you're not, you've really kind of blown your chances for the day. And so that's how they're also used for telling time. And so again, there's these functional aspects, but then there's also these deeply like spiritual aspects and worldview components too. So, you know, how widespread was this? That was kind of a question too. Is this something that's really unique to Snook, or is this something that, you know, other elders know, and this is something that's carried across the language family? And so through this process of, you know, snowball sampling or peer referral, basically asking elders, you know, who else do you think would know about this that I could talk to? That's kind of how this project ended up, you know, waltzing across the subarctic to all these different communities, were through relations and through being told to go work with somebody and making connections and just following the work where it was leading. And so also an Alaskan example, Nicoltani is a very similar constellation in the Otna region. I worked with Charlie Hubbard a lot on this. He's from Cantwell. But if you look at the stars, they're almost identical to the Gwich'in version. A little bit of variation there, that the foot is kind of like a raptor's foot with talons and toes. And there's subtle variation, but you know, the names are the same, but you know, in the Otna language. And so through this work, I learned there's 5 of these in Alaska. Five Dene cultures have these whole sky constellations, including lower Tanana, Dena, which is, you know, the lands here that we're on now. And so anyway, I want to play this video of Charlie Hubbard. He was an incredible teacher. He really changed my thinking about the world and reality in very you know, in very meaningful ways. He passed away in 2021, but he knew this information just in great detail, and he gave me a lot of the language and vocabulary for, you know, how to talk about these things and how to think about these things, and the idea of hunting and you know, different ceremonies that his grandfather, you know, who was a medicine person, would do to help trappers, you know, have success before going out, and ways of talking to Nicoltani and praying and all of these things. And so I want to play this video of, and it's kind of quiet, so you may have to turn up the volume a touch, but this is Charlie talking about basically how you think of this constellation and kind of what it means.
He reigns with the earth, our land, our world. Necoltan. He takes care of the land. And that's, you know, Nanasu, who makes us in, is the way we should think. Who dollars still cheap. That's how we live.
Yeah, so he provided this concept of, you know, if you respect the world, you respect Nicoltani, and vice versa. You know, to disrespect the world is also to disrespect Nicoltani, and vice versa. And so it's also this idea that, you know, we are the world and the world is us. And so that's why you take care of the world, and you respect things in a certain way, because again, it's all related and it's all you at some point, you know, in time, either past, present, or future. So I'm going to try to get to the end here. There's so much I could talk about, but I also kind of want to just demonstrate here that this also carries through into Canada. And so I worked there in the Northwest Territories a lot with the Yellowknives Dene, and also with the Sahtu. And so I worked with another Charlie there, Charlie Nayeli, who is, people refer to him as, you know, the spiritual leader in their community. And it's a really special community. There's so much language that's used, you know, as an outsider. If you don't speak the language, you know, that's all that's used in meetings. You're going to kind of be lost. Most people speak English, but there's some elders still there who are monolingual in their Indigenous language, even though they often speak more than one Dene language. But Charlie Nayeli was amazing. He could tell these traveler stories for days. Like, I have never met somebody who knew those stories, just could basically talk about them, unending, in his language or in English. And so kind of how I approached elders with this is I would go, I'd be, referred, like, you should go talk to this person, and I'd get the phone number and I'd call them up, or, call somebody else who had a connection to that elder and see if they'd be interested in meeting with me. And when I got to meet with them, I would usually say, I usually try to share my experience. Like, this is what I did with these elders in Alaska. And once I was able to share that experience, elders were very much more open to just kind of diving in and talking. I didn't have to go out and repeat the same thing I've already done. And so it was really, I think it seemed once they knew that I was informed about this and it had learned about it in this experience-based way, it really opened the door to just talking about it with lots of elders very openly. And so Charlie there, the first time we met, I explained what I knew, and I asked if they had something similar, because the Big Dipper in his language is called Hita, which is cognate to Hyati. And so, there's patterns that you can kind of follow. And, so I got done telling him, and he was very quiet there. And then he spent the next 3 hours or so telling these stories. And he said, so there's a little bit, like it goes on and on and on. And if we had a week, then you'd really understand. But we took a break there in this very spiritual log cabin or building where we were working. It's called the Prophet's House. And it's a very ceremonial location in Dene, where you go, and it was very intentional that we meet in this building to talk about this topic. And when we went outside, and he pointed up to the stars and told me, the same thing, that Yamare is in the stars, and he pointed it out, and the figure was quite different. It's smaller over there. It doesn't cover the whole sky, but the rest of the stars, are part of this. Those are the star names. I don't know if okay, there's that picture on the lower right. That's the figure of Yamarea, the one who went around the world. Charlie drew that. And so it's a smaller constellation, and the Big Dipper is this like cooking vessel or pot. And all the other stars in the sky are the spirits of, past beings. And they're all swirling around and flowing into that pot. And inside the middle of the pot is like the element of fire. And so there's 3 braided patterns. And so the idea is that one is all the beings of the water, all the beings of the air, and all the beings of the land. And all these spirits are, swirling into the pot. And, if you're in need, you talk to Yamarea, and, he lowers his dipper down, and you get help in that way. Because again, there's this idea that it's the spiritual embodiment of all things up there. And he also has a heart too. And in Satu, it's called Edze, which is an indefinite, it's something's heart, which is interesting that it doesn't use the third person prefix for his or hers or its. It's something's, and it's because it's everybody's heart, it's the embodiment of all hearts. And Etena, I think that's how you say it, is the Milky Way. It's something's trail. It's really the people's path. Dene Tolu is also how they say that, the people's path. And so the concept and the stories are completely parallel, but there's these variations in different Dene cultures. And so, it was really, really profound to work with one elder and then kind of go across 12 different Dene languages, spanning close to 1,000 miles, and just hearing elders kind of repeat the same things, and you get this feel for how the knowledge is, it's not invented, it's carried and maintained, for a very long time. And so with this work, starting out with this Big Dipper, that's the only name, and kind of exploding it into this completely unique astronomical knowledge system, unique to any world culture that we've seen so far, and seeing that it does have this deep continuity and deep antiquity across a language family. That's really kind of the work that we did, but also showing that, we're not trivializing a constellation to a story about a picture in the stars. It's a whole epistemology and worldview that's intimately related with, the structuring of the universe and how to live and relate and be with all things. And I haven't worked with Navajo in the American Southwest, but there's some older documentation done in the 30s and 40s by Berard Hale, and he has this little tiny booklet called Star Lore Among the Navajo. And in that, there's these traveler transformer brothers who are also constellations. And even though the American Southwest has a completely different view of the sky, they also subdivide all their constellations into body part star groups. Any star that's more than one or two stars is named after body parts, and some of them are very unique. They have a heart, they have a cane, they have hair. And so you don't see that in any of the other cultures, so it's something that seems to be very uniquely Dene, but also has this deep antiquity. And there was even more recent documentation done in the 90s by Trudy Griffin Pierce, who also documented these traveler constellations broken into body part subgroups. The reason that it's so elegant in Alaska to have a whole sky constellation cover the entire sky, it works here, right? The stars are very circumpolar, so when they're rising, they're moving sideways. It's not like in the equator where they go straight up and overhead and there's always new stars coming up, right? As you go further towards the poles stars, you see fewer stars, but those stars that you see stay in view for a really long time. And so it's possible to have a whole sky constellation in these polar regions because they remain in view. And instead of doing something like the Greeks did, where there's all these constellations and you have to kind of mentally know how they relate, it's a really elegant system for mapping the sky because you're already familiar with a body part, the bilateral symmetry. If it's cloudy and you see the two stars that are in the left hand, you can infer where all the other star groups are based on that familiar pattern, and you know where the right hand is. And so if you're turned around, you can infer the locations and use it for wayfinding. And it's not easy because the stars are always moving sideways. And so, that was another really fascinating thing working with Paul, is that in the literature, it's often been said you can't use circumpolar stars for wayfinding because they're always going sideways. And then, Paul told me how he does it, and he basically memorizes the position of the traveler in relation to the major local river. And so he has that knowledge of, several positions throughout the night, but also for different seasons. And so that's rote memorization. And so when he does go out on the land and say follows a wounded moose and gets kind of turned around, he knows where the body parts would be relative to the river. And so if his nose is here, he can remember, oh yeah, this time of night at this season, the nose is related to this, in this orientation to the river. And so my boat's on the river, I know which stars to follow to get back to the river. And so it's a pretty elegant system that's very complex, but in his view, you have to do it every day. And that's kind of the underlying lesson here, is you have to experience it and you have to live it. You can't just do it every once in a while and rely on it. It's something that takes a lot of practice and time. So I recently published a book about this, and I did bring some copies, but I called the book In the Footsteps of the Traveler. And really the reason for that was that, to be immersed into this knowledge system is to kind of walk in the footsteps of this traveler, to be on the land. And, that's how you learn about it, is going out and kind of following in that path. You live your life on Earth by those laws and protocols and rules that the traveler established, but then, in the next life, you also follow that Milky Way path that the traveler, blazed for humanity back up to where you become again. And so the Milky Way, it unites the different layers of the cosmos, and it's the path that you walk on Earth, and it's the path that you walk in the afterlife too. And so it's this huge epistemology, this huge metaphor for how to gain knowledge, how to gain power, how to live and relate to all things. So that's the book that came out in April. These are some the contents I thought I'd show just so you can see the kind of range of topics. There's 2 very long chapters about the traveler, and that's just basically these sketches in showing the comparison and documentation in each of the areas where I worked. Then there's a chapter on, kind of the functional aspects of stars, using stars for time reckoning, wayfinding, weather forecasting. Like twinkling stars are often used for predicting different types of weather, or how big and bright they are, indicate different changes in temperature. There's a chapter on the sun, moon, and eclipses. I worked with about 11 elders who were in eclipse ceremonies when they were kids. They were very scary events, but it was really amazing to work with elders who actually lived those and knew what it was all about. And then there's 2 chapters on, I call it beings of the atmosphere, because all of these atmospheric phenomena are really they're animate beings. So rainbows, thunderbirds, halos, northern lights, and then there's a section there on different methods for deterring weather. In a world that's animate and sentient, your human behaviors have efficacy. The way, if a storm is approaching and you can deter those. There's practices for deterring the storm, because of you can be a threat to that sentient thing, and there's different ways to cut those storms apart or to deter them. And so there's a section there on different practices for changing the weather. And then there's one on colors of the sky, which is just knowledge about what those different colors in the sky mean, and there's lots of language. It was kind of a priority to try to find the names for everything and then put that into context. And so there's sections that are all transcribed in the Dene language with the translations as well. And then there's a couple appendices, and that's it for tonight. I'll quickly click through some photos just as kind of a photo essay. I think it's nice. Photos provide context just to kind of see more about the different things we saw in the sky and places I was with, and maybe a few more people who were involved. So that's Charlie Hubbard again. This is Snook out on his trap line with his nephew. He's singeing a porcupine in the Yukon Flats. This is one of our trips. This is near the Canadian border on the upper Porcupine River. Also on the Porcupine. This is Trimble Gilbert and his house in Vachericot, or Arctic Village. These are caribou hooves. That's an emergency food, and the tendons are left on, so when you cut it, harvest a caribou, you tie those around a tree as emergency food. If you're in a starvation time, you can happen upon a hoof tied to a tree and boil that and get enough, energy to keep you going. And so again, there was so much, when you actually live and stay with elders and travel the land, there's just so much that informs that larger picture of that topic that you're, supposedly, working on. This is Great Bear Lake again. It's working with Charlie. That's a linguist back there, Alex Jaker. He works with Tetzot Dene, or the Yellowknives Dene in Yellowknife and Dilo, Deda. And so oftentimes I would work with a linguist, and I picked up a lot of, learning how to work with languages from about 5 different linguists I worked with. This was working, again, at Great Bear Lake. That's Mandy Beha. She is first language speaker of Satu, and that's 2 elders and someone who's working as a translator. And so, sometimes it worked great just to kind of step back and let people talk. And so a lot of this work was done just in the Satu language, and really great language recordings and things like that. But it was really humbling just, to share lives with so many people, and just, it really was like a pleasant, just amazing research experience that seemed like everybody kind of wanted to be part of it. And a common reaction was, I haven't thought of this for a long time. Or, community members, I never thought about the stars, and then that would generate a lot of, momentum to try to see if anybody knew anything. And then sometimes you end up as the person who gets interviewed. So that was going on the radio in Dene, and that gets reversed. But that's part of research, is, I think in the social sciences you do have to share in that humility and humanity of research, and you have to share parts about yourself if you want to go deep on something. You have to, in my view, it's kind of like, you have to share juicy things too, and that creates trust, right? People aren't going to tell a lot of things about themselves if you're not also giving that sensitive information up about your own self. So, yeah, it's just so fun to work on this kind of thing and try to go deep on a topic and really learn in a meaningful and immersive way. This is Great Bear Lake. When I was on my last trip there, they gave me a drum, a caribou hide drum, and when I was doing that work, it was really important. Mandy and Charlie told me that you know this conceptually, but you're never really going to learn it unless you allow yourself to experience the spiritual dimension of this. And that was kind of a boundary for me that was hard to cross. And when I kind of allowed myself to let go and just try it out and experience that as a reality, there was a noticeable difference in just my own filters and what I was able to kind of pick up and learn. But they gave me that drum to write about this work, they said, with vision and clarity. And so it was a pretty big gift. And that's the Great Bear River there. These are an eclipse sequence up there, and then just the lunar phases. This is working in Tetlin and Northway. That's Avis Sam with a pair of boots. She's quite elderly now. And then that's Olga Levick. She's a linguist at Avis and Roy Sam's house. And then Oscar Jimmy, he passed away. He knew lots about the stars too. And then that's Roy David down there. He's from Tetlin, and that mountain behind is Nadaihu, and that's where the Thunderbird lives. It's near Tanacross. This is Dorothy Titus in Tetlin. She knows quite a bit about the stars, and more trips with Snook in the Yukon River, and then up in Chalkitsik. That's a lake near Chalkitsik. This is his cabin in Chalkitsik, in the Dranjik River. And this is outside his place in Fort Yukon. So this is where we first learned about that constellation, where he first pointed it out, was right near this spot here. And Great Bear Lake, Smith's Landing. This is in northern Alberta, working with elders. We flew in, I think, 8 elders from 5 provinces, all Dene Astronomy, to work on this, and the First Nation fully funded it, and it was incredible to have that kind of support. Different foods, different Gwich'in foods. This is Bobby Sai Nikolai. He passed away quite a while ago, I think in 2014. He's 96. And Jim Nikolai in the bottom, he passed away too. Emma Northway and her daughter, Charlene Cleary. Emma was 99 there in the picture working with her. And she's from Mansfield originally, but Tana Cross is where most of her family lives. And this is the kind of being shown where an eclipse ceremony happened in 1943 on the other side of the river in Northway. At the old Northway site, they moved when it was flooded. Setting beaver snares with snook. And then these are different groups that provided funding and support, and that's it. So I can take questions, and thanks for coming out. I will, you know, I did bring these just in case anybody does want to buy one. They're $35. All my proceeds go to the Doyon Foundation, but there are some copies if anyone is wanting to grab one.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay, if you'll speak directly into the mic, then everybody can hear.
Boss, thank you so much for sharing the knowledge that you were able to gather. As I'm sitting here as a Indigenous person, you know, I'm sitting here thinking, who are you? Where did you come from? That's one of our traditional ways of introductions. Tell us, you know, where you come from and who you are. So
Yeah.
I'm curious about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm from Montana. I moved up here in 2001, and I came up to be a bush pilot. And I was in a school in Anchorage in the flight program, and it was kind of steering everyone towards commercial airlines, and I really didn't want to do that. Ended up, you know, getting a degree in wildlife biology, but I've been in Fairbanks since 2003, and a lot of time here on campus. But I have 3 daughters, and I teach in the Indigenous Studies program. Most of the classes I teach are research design, methods, cultural and intellectual property rights. I am teaching a class this fall in Indigenous Astronomical Knowledge. I taught a writing class. Yeah, my family is still mostly all in Montana. And my grandparents lived in Michigan and Rhode Island.
Whereabouts in Montana?
Helena? Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious what your next plans are. What are you working on that's very intentional and that you've learned through this process working with elders that you have to be intentional?
Yeah, well, you know, in my mind, I wanted to do something that, you know, the community envisioned, and so I'm currently working on a project with Snook. It was his idea. He wants to make these videos, you know, basically filming him demonstrating a practice on the land that are narrated in his language, and so we're using GoPros mostly because it's very mobile and they do stabilize well, but then it's also being recorded with an external audio recorder to get that better sound quality for the language. And they're intended to have very minimal editing, and we're calling them legacy recordings, and you know, between him and the tribe they'll decide where they go. But the idea is to integrate some of those into the Quechin language class. And you know, kind of depending, like get permission on maybe different uses for those. But you know, Paul is still very active, so it's a great chance to continue doing this. And it's very different because, you know, there's not really a research question. It's not really theoretically driven, which makes it hard to get funding. It's really a documentation project that he wants to do, and hopefully through that documentation we'll end up doing maybe another book about his life that has embedded practices that he wants to share with, you know, appendices on like you know, different topical domains of traditional knowledge and practices. So it's working with very focused on one person now as opposed to across the subarctic, and so it's different, but it's also a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. A little bit different sky and far away. Inca Empire and the Wadi and the Tiwanaku Forum. Have you found any correlations?
I always read about it. I haven't worked there myself, but I think like the song lines kind of have a similar kind of thing. Song lines are like either these places on the environment where there's these transformations through time, and you follow these paths, and they remind you of the origin or transformation of the world.
In Australia?
Yeah. Is that what you're referring to?
No,
Oh, I'm sorry.
In South America.
Oh,
Inca,
South America.
Inca, Wadi, Tiwanaku.
No. I mean, I think you'll find some common themes wherever you learn about that, but I don't know a lot of. I've read about Baroro, like in Brazil, their astronomy just through reading. I know there's a lot of social organization based on like patterning society off of what's in the sky, but I don't really know too much about it. Yeah.
Any other question?
I'm just curious, have you ever found you're working in a domain of the intellect all the time, quite a bit? I mean, how do you put that aside to get the spiritual? You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Not overthinking.
Yeah, I really, I found there's this idea that, doing research in the social sciences, like this kind of work, can be approached as an experience in socialization. And so that's kind of how I think about it. It's in that lens that, like, particularly as an outsider, like, I don't know anything, I'm not socialized. And so to learn something, I have to become socialized, kind of like, like you have to learn everything, how to knock on the door, how to cut up meat, how to ask for something, like it's all, when I started this, I didn't know that. And it's hard. If you don't pick it up, and if you don't change your behavior or your actions, then you're going to have problems. And so, like, to approach the work as an experience in socialization, I think can be really useful when you're an outsider working on cultural knowledge. That, I don't see myself, as like in that ivory tower using jargon that nobody can understand. Like, the way that I communicate is intended to be for a functional communication. And I go out of my way to try to, like, I think you have to try to, this is something we talk about in our classes, but I think that doing this kind of work, you have to produce the knowledge in the way that it's produced in the community. And, writing is, like, say, a dissertation or a book it's not how elders produce knowledge, but you have to put it into that context of trying to write in a way that's kind of mimicking that, or at least providing the context to walk through that process so that the knowledge is understood in that way. And so, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Well, it's 8:15, and so I think, unless there's any last-minute question, one question, and then, all right, then we'll wrap up.
And I can linger around too if there's more questions.
I was just curious, Orion is such a iconic constellation in so many cultures. Did it play any particular role in the traveler that it would, I couldn't see it as I was looking, so it's just not meaningful in that.
I learned from two elders a couple names for it, but it's not really part of that. And, that's the unique thing. It's a cultural system that's not, the emphasis is not the same as a Western culture. Like the Polaris, the North Star, it's mostly unnoticed. North is, the directional systems are different. It's not it's not a cardinal direction, north, south, east, or west. The directional system's based on the regional flow of water. And so the fact that the North Star is in the north doesn't really matter when your directional system is not oriented like that. And so there's a totally different focus on stars, and very, very dim stars have names, which is also, I think significant. Yeah. Good question, though.
Thank you very much, everyone.